So, good morning, everybody. We are continuing with the review of the third chapter of Megillah. And we are holding Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, 23a, towards the bottom of the page. 2, 4, 6, 8 lines from the bottom of the page. Toner Rabbanon, Hakol Oilin Leminyan Shiva. Everybody is going to count towards the 7 that are to be called up on Shabbos. And the Chiddush here is that this includes even a minor and even a woman. So we know that you need to call up 7 people on Shabbos. And included in those number is a child who's called up to the Torah and even a woman who's called up to the Torah. However, the rabbi said that a woman should not be called up to read from the Torah out of dignity for the congregation. And some of the commentaries explain that what it means, the kavod hatzibur, right, is that women are not obligated to read from the Torah. Men are obligated, and if a woman is called up to read, it would appear as if the men are not able to do it, and therefore it would be a disrespect to the congregation that they are not learned and they're not able to come up and read, and instead they have to have a woman come up and read. There are other explanations given as well, but that's the one I prefer to share at the moment. Okay, so now the Gemara discusses whether maftir is the one who's called up to read the Haftorah. So he reads a small section from the Torah, but the real reason why he's called up is to read the Haftorah. So the question is, does he count towards the number 7, or is he going to be separate from the 7? So there was a dispute about this matter between Rav Huna and Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba. One of them says that the guy who gets called up for maftir actually counts as one of the 7, and the other says no, he doesn't count as 7. In other words, he would be the 8th, and you would need to have 7 people being called up to read from the Torah apart from the guy who's called up for maftir. Now, the Gemara wants to explain the reason for it. The guy who says that the guy called up for maftir is counted, he rules this way because at the end of the day, this guy ends up reading from the Torah as well. But the guy who says that you're not going to be counted, right? He holds like Ula. What did Ula say? Ula said, why must one read from the Haftorah? Why, in other words, why must the guy who reads from the Torah also read from the Torah? It's because out of respect for the Torah. What does that mean? Rashi explains that what this means is if I'm going to have somebody called up and the only thing he's going to do is read from the Torah, I'm going to assume that the reading from the prophets and reading from the Torah are on equal footing. Not just that. You have 7 people called up for the Torah reading, and one guy who, so to speak, corresponds to all the 7, right? You have 7 people being called up for the Torah, and one guy for the reading of the prophets. So therefore, in order to show honor to the Torah, we make sure that the person who's going to be reading from the book of the prophets, which means the Torah, he also gets called up to read from the Torah. But it's just so as not to dishonor the Torah that he gets called up. Therefore, it doesn't count for the number of people who are being called up for the reading of the Torah. And therefore, he would be number 8, not the 7th. He wouldn't count as the 7th. Now, when you say that the maftir is not counted as one of the 7 Torah readers, so this is going to be challenged from a brisa. It says in the brisa, the one who reads the Torah from the prophets should not read a selection of less than 21 verses. Now, if that's the case, 21. Why would you call 21 people up? The reason why you're going to call 21 people up, the reason why you should read no less than 21 verses is corresponding to the 7 people who are called up to the Torah. 7 times 3 is 21. We know that when you get called up to the Torah, you should not read less than 3 verses. And 3 times 7 is 21. So therefore, we read 21 verses in the Haftorah. If that's the case, if you're saying now that the guy called up for the Haftorah is not included in the 7, then you don't have 7 people being called up. You have 8 people being called up. And so when it comes to how many verses you should be reading from the Torah, it shouldn't be 21. It should be 24. Why? Because 8 times 3 is 24. So therefore, the fact that the Brisa tells me you only read 21 verses, that implies that there are only 7 people that are going to be called up, and that's how you get to the number 21. So therefore, the guy being called up for Maftir obviously must be the one who's considered to be part of the 7. Does that make sense? Simple arithmetics. So the Gemara answers no.
Rabbi.
Yep.
Before the Haftarah was instituted, Torah was only 7 people were called up.
Correct.
So if that's the case, why would anybody want to say that the Maftir is part of the 7? When there was no Maftir, there was no Haftarah to be read.
Well, that itself is the question. The question is, once you're calling a guy up for Maftir, should he be the one who's going to be the 7th of all the readers that we're anyway going to call up? Or does he get his own separate aliyah where he's not going to be dividing a portion of the Torah which he will read, but rather he's going to, as what we do, our custom is, to repeat the last few verses that has already been read. So that's the question.
I understand, but that's not my question. Okay. My question was originally.
So originally,
there were only 7 people called up, and there was no Haftarah read.
Right.
There was no such thing. So if we're following that, and the Haftarah came along because of extenuating circumstances that existed, where people wouldn't be allowed to read the Torah, and so the rabbis came along and said, read something from the Haftarah to be representative of what the Torah reading would have been. So for sure, it's an extra whatever. So therefore, if we go by what originally existed, the Maftir is not considered one of the original 7.
So the answer to that is that, as you correctly pointed out, the Haftarah was instituted later on. And when they instituted the Haftarah, it was in place of the Torah reading because they were not allowed to read the Torah reading. So the question then became, once the Torah reading was once again allowed, do we discontinue reading the Haftarah, or do we continue reading the Haftarah?
Continue after.
So they decided to continue reading the Haftarah. Now the question is, what should we do? Should we call this guy up just to read the Haftarah, or do we call him up to also read from the Torah? So that's what we just discussed in the Gemara, that because we want to give honor to the Torah, we don't just call him up to read the Haftarah without getting him to read also from the Torah. Okay, now that we've established that we also call him up to read from the Torah so as not to disrespect the Torah, what kind of call up does he get? Does he get a call up as one of the 7? So therefore, he'll be reading from the Torah, and then he'll just kind of continue his turn, so to speak, by reading the Haftarah? Or do we say that no, he's not counted as one of the 7 who's called up for the regular Torah reading? He's going to get his own separate call up, which is going to be call up number 8. And he'll read a small section from the Torah, and then he'll read the Haftarah. So we're trying to infer from the fact that we say that the Haftarah should correspond to the 21 verses, right? So I guess when they established that the Haftarah should be no less than 21 verses, they had already gone back. They'd already gone back to reading the Torah every week. So the question they're dealing with then is, what do? Do we put 21 verses in, or do we put 24 verses in? So the Gemara is trying to imply from this brisa, the fact that it was decided to put 21 verses in, that could serve as a support to the fact that the guy being called up for Maftir, Haftorah, he's called up as number 7, not as number 8. Otherwise, they would have instituted 24 verses, says the Gemara. And this is where the answer is. This is where we're holding. So the answer is given the Mishum covered the Torah, because the only reason he's getting to read from the Torah scroll before reading the Haftorah is out of respect for the Torah, and it's not to fulfill the obligation of reading from the Torah. So therefore they didn't add it. Therefore, they didn't add an extra 3 verses corresponding to his call up, and so therefore it's an 8th call up. It's an 8th call up and not a 7th call up. So I think that's how they got to this conclusion. So now, moving on to 23b. So the Rava questions the ruling of the Brisa that a minimum of 21 verses are required for the Haftorah, because we have a Haftorah in Parshas Tzav which has less than 21 verses, and yet we read it. So the Gemara says that although this is the general rule of thumb, you need to have at least 21, there are certain exceptions. One exception is where the topic ends. If the topic ends, 1 verse short, right? So like 20 verses instead of 21 verses, then we'll allow you to stop there, because otherwise you're going to start a whole new topic, and we're not interested in that. So that's why we allow you to stop. But it's the rare exception. It's not the rule. And the Gemara also says, that in a case when the topic does not end, right? In other words, early. So they're challenging this ruling based on what Rav Shmuel Ba'Abba said, that on occasions he stood in the presence of Rabbi Yechanan, and when he had read 10 verses, then he said to us, stop. So after 10 verses in the Haftorah, that was already enough in the presence of Rabbi Yechanan. So therefore, how does that fit with the ruling that you just given, that you need to have a minimum of 21 unless the topic ends early? Here we had a case where they read 10 verses and Rabbi Yechanan said it was enough. So the Gemara answers that the case of Rabbi Yechanan is different, because in the place of where Rabbi Yechanan was, the way they would do the Haftorah is they would read the Haftorah and they would have somebody translating it, just like they would have somebody reading the Torah and translating it. They'd have somebody reading the Haftorah and translating it. And so therefore, when do we say that you read 21 verses? Only in a place where there's no translator. But when there is a translator, you can stop even before then, because you don't want to keep people there all day. If you're going to have 21 verses and you're going to have somebody translating every verse, you're going to be there all day. So 10 was going to be considered enough. That's the end of this section. Any questions before we move on to the next Mishnah? If you have something that you want to ask, then please.
Rabbi,
yes.
I'm just a little confused here. We call 7 people up on Shabbos.
Yes.
That's with the maftir.
No, the maftir is 8. You call up 7 people before you say Kaddish. After you say Kaddish, you call up an 8th person. And then
we repeat the 3 lines, and then okay.
All good?
Yes.
Okay. So now, moving on, the next Mishnah continues the discussion about the laws related to the reading from the Torah and from the Nevi'im, and it tells us like this, that you want to do something like reading the Torah or reading the Haftorah, right, as well as other things. They need to be done in the presence of the Shema. So let's look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah says like this: we cannot divide the Shema. What's the idea of personal Shema? Divide the Shema. Sometimes people would come late to the synagogue, and they would miss the Baruch Hu, and they would miss saying the Shema with the minyan. So what they would do is they would go back, and they would gather a few people together, making sure that there was a minyan there. And what they would do is they would divide the Shema, which means they would say Kaddish, they would say Baruch Hu, and they would say the first blessing of the Shema. That's what they would do. Okay, so this cannot be done without 10 people present. Likewise, you cannot go down to repeat the Amidah without 10 people. You cannot do the priestly benediction, the Birchat Kohanim, without 10 people. You cannot read the Torah without 10 people. You cannot read the Haftorah without 10 people. And we do not do a special standing and sitting that's done at a funeral where you're told to stand and sit at a funeral without 10 people. And likewise, we do not say the blessing, the mourner's blessing, with less than 10. The Gemara is going to explain this, right? And now, we also do not do the consolation to the mourners less than 10, and we do not do the wedding blessings less than 10, and we do not do the special invitation for grace after meals by mentioning Hashem's name without 10 people. Likewise, when it comes to the appraisal of special land that had been consecrated and you want to redeem it, you want to swap it for money, in other words, you have pledged a particular field should go to the Beis HaMikdash, right? And thereby you're now obligated to give the worth of that land. You now have to redeem it. So who's going to appraise it? So you need you need a quorum to be able to appraise it, and the quorum has to be at least 10 people, 9 of which can be anybody, and at least one has to be a kohen. And the same is true when it comes to somebody who says that I want to give my worth to the Beis HaMikdash. How is he going to be estimated in terms of given a value of how much he owes now to the Beis HaMikdash? That also needs to have 9 and a kohen present. Okay, so that's the Mishnah. Any questions on the Mishnah before we move on?
Yeah, question, Rabbi.
Yes.
The way this thing is written, you can interpret that each and every one of these things requires 9 and a coin.
No. It's because when it comes along, it says Pachos Ma'asara, right? That's the end of all the things included in the group we just mentioned. Then when it goes on to say Uver Karka'is, when it comes to the appraisal of consecrated land, there it's a separate case, which is why we left it to the end of the Mishnah after we finished saying the ruling for the group of items that we mentioned before. And we say this one needs to have Tish and a Kohen, and we say the same applies with a person who consecrates his value and pledges it to the Beis HaMikdash. So when it comes to when it comes to reading the Torah or any of the other things that we mentioned, you don't need to have 9 Israelites and a Kohen. Okay. Says the Gemara. Yeah.
Where it says Ve'adam Kiyotze Bahen, we're talking, that's the person who's doing the consecration of the.
Well, it means that there's two things one can consecrate to the Beis HaMikdash. You can either consecrate land, which therefore needs to be swapped out, right, for money, and a human being, right? Both of these things, the way you end up giving their value to the coin is by estimating it and then giving it. But when it comes to, let's say, money itself, you give directly, and it could be other articles, let's say an animal or whatever else it might be. Those things generally you take the animal and you give it straight to the Beis HaMikdash. Here we're talking about when you want to appraise it in order to be able to give the value of it to the Beis HaMikdash. For that you need to have a minyan present. You need to have a quorum of 10. And none of whom can be anybody, but one of them has to be a kohen. Yes, Ben.
I'm sorry, I was writing notes and I didn't get what does it mean? En porsim al hashma ve'en ovrim lifnei hateva.
Okay, en porsim al hashma means we do not divide the Shema, which means that if you have 10 people who had already prayed individually, right, at home, let's say, and they come into the synagogue after the congregation has already recited the Shema, then one of the 10 can go and recite half of the Shema, which means to say, you say Kaddish, Baruch Hu, and then you say the first blessing of the Shema. We know that the Shema has 2 blessings before and 2 blessings after. Okay, so we say one of the first blessings, which is Yotze Or Vorech Choshech. That's the blessing that they may say. So that's called dividing the Shema. You cannot do that without 10 people. The second thing is going down to the ark, which means to lead the congregation for the repetition of the Amidah. So it's referred to as over in Lifnei Teva, but what it's referring to specifically is the recitation of the repetition of the Amidah. Okay?
But why? I don't understand. אין פורסים על השמה ואין עוברים לפני התיבה. But the guy that repeats it's not 10 people that are going up to the teva.
That's correct. We need 10 people in the room present.
Oh, in the room, okay.
That's right. Otherwise, it's going to be a bracha.
But עוברים mean passing by the teva, you know.
Yeah, but what it means is to go in front of.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, so now the Gemara. So the Gemara says, how do you know all these rules telling me that you need to have a quorum of 10 people in order to be able to do all of these things? So Reb Chia Ba'Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, because it says in the scripture, V'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael, and I shall be sanctified in the midst of the Jewish people. And the key word over here is b'toch. The word toch means in the midst of. Rabbi Yochanan says, from here we learn that anything when it comes to matters of sanctity, you should not have less than 10. Should not have less than 10. So now the question is obvious. How do you get 10, the number 10, out of that verse? The verse just says, I shall be sanctified among the children of Israel. From where do you see in that verse that in all matters of Kedusha, you have to have 10? The Gemara answers, this is something that was taught by Reb Chia, that we have a Gzera Shava using the word Toich. The word Toich appears in one situation, and it appears in another verse in another situation. One place it's clear how many people are it's speaking of, and another is not clear. So we take the clarity from one and we import it to the ambiguity to clear up the ambiguity of the other. However, what we're going to see over here is when it's not so straightforward. We're not going to be just learning from one verse to another. We're going to be learning from one verse to another, and then from a third verse, we're going to apply to the second verse, which we're going to equally apply back to the first verse. So watch how this is done. It says, V'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael. That is what Rabbi Yochanan quoted as the source to know that you have to have 10 people when it comes to matters of Kedusha. Now, it says elsewhere, right, with regards to the rebellion of Korach, right, it says that you should separate mitoich ha'edah, from among the congregation. So now, you've got 2 words over here. In the first verse, we have just the word toich. Here in this verse, when we're talking about separating yourself from the people, it uses the word edah. So from the midst of the edah. So you got 2 words, toich and edah. And now we're going to go to a third place, which talks about the meraglim, where over there it says, how long shall this evil congregation exist, which means Edah refers to the group of the spies. So just like when it says Edah in the case of the spies, we're talking about 10. So too over here with the case of Korach, when it says remove yourself from mitoich, from amidst the Edah. So there too, where it says toich, mitoich Edah, it refers to from the congregation, which is 10. So too, we're going to bring this back to the first verse. The toich over there is also going to be 10. Okay? Did everybody follow along with that, or should I do it again?
No.
You have like this. You have let's work backwards. We have the most clear, The most clear is the case of the spies, where Hashem says, how long shall this evil congregation exist, right? So there we know that a congregation consists of 10. How do we know this? Very simple. Moshe sent 12 spies, and 2 of them remained loyal. That's Yeshua and Kalev. And you minus 2 from 12, you're left with 10. So there we know clearly from the Torah that when it says Ada, meaning congregation, a congregation is 10. Now that we've established that fact, we go to the story of Kairach, where it says that you should remove yourself, separate yourself from mitoich Ada, from among the congregation. So just like the congregation is 10, because we're comparing it to the story of the spies, where it says Ada. So too over here in the case of Kairach, it's also talking about a congregation, which is 10. And once we're using the word toich as well, from among, right? So the word among tells me that it's also, when we use the word toich, it can be speaking of 10. And therefore we go back to the first verse, which says, V'nikdashti b'seich b'nei Yisrael, and I will be sanctified among the children of Israel. What does it mean among? When there are 10 present. When you have a quorum of 10, that's when you can do all matters of sanctity, of holiness, of kedusha, and that's the source of the minyan. Yes,
Rabbi, Ada and Toich. What is Ada equal to, and what is Toich equal to? Because if you're basing the quorum, the minyan, based on the negative aspect, if you had 2 spies that were loyal to Hashem, and why are they basing it on the negative? The ones that are, I don't understand this. Why would it be based on that?
That's an excellent question, and there are many commentaries that deal with this question. And let's just establish the limud, and then answer your question. The limud is like this: a verbal analogy, which is a gzer shava. We take a word that appears in one place and a word that appears in another place. If they're the same word or they're very, very similar in their etymology, so then we come and we say we'll take from the clarity that exists in that passage and we'll import it into this passage where it's not so clear. So when it says V'nikdashti b'seich b'nei Yisrael, I will be sanctified among the children of Israel, it's not clear how many people are required for this quorum for Hashem to be sanctified in their midst. So therefore I go to another place where it says the word toich, and there it is clearer how many people, and that it is 10. How is it clear that it's 10 from that place? Well, that is through a gzer shava from somewhere else where it says Adar, and there it's clear that it's 10. That's how we have this indirect derivation of how we know that 10 are required for a minyan. Now, as to your question, why do we learn it out from the spies who were the negative? Is because you have to realize that although the spies, right, ended up making a colossal mistake in not following instructions perfectly, nevertheless, deep down in their hearts, they thought they were doing the right thing. They thought they were doing the right thing. And so too, when it comes to a minyan, you cannot just look at people and judge them based on what appears at the surface. Otherwise, you'd never be making a minyan. You'd always be saying, this one's no good for a minyan, and that one's no good for a minyan, because they all have to be like Yeshua and Kalev, who made no mistakes. Therefore, we go and we look at the people who did make a mistake, and we say that we learn from the story of the spies that a congregation, even when they make a mistake, they are still holy. And therefore, when it comes to reciting Kedusha and Kaddish and Baruch Hu, etc., you can do so even if the people who are making up the minyan are not perfect. Okay? That's one of the reasons given. I'm sure there are many, many other reasons given. The Mefarshim go to town about this elsewhere. Okay. So now, well, actually, it's probably over here that they discuss it. But anyway,
you also have the Ketoret, Rabbi.
Like that's right, like the Ketoret that has the is it the Chelban?
Has two very pungent.
Right, I think it's one. The Chelban, if I'm not mistaken, is very
Yet if it's left out, then Chayav Mita.
That's why Tzibur is an acronym for Tzadikim, Beinanim, or Rishoim. Right? You need to have all. You can't just have Tzadikim. You can't just have Beinanim. You also have to have Rishoim. And in fact, it says that if any tinus that doesn't have Rishoim in it as well, it's not considered a valid tinus. You have to include the entire community. Okay. So our Mishnah said like this. Our Mishnah said that we do not make the standing and sitting tributes at a funeral unless there are 10 men present. Why is this? Why do you need to have 10? Because since the leader of the funeral has to say, stand, dear ones, right? Stand, sit, dear ones, sit. In other words, Yikarim means like honorable ones, right? Stand, honorable ones. So you don't want to use that terminology for less than 10. Why? Because what are you going to do when you have a bigger crowd? What kind of terminology are you going to use to give them the proper honor for there being a significant crowd? Therefore, we say, don't use this terminology unless there are 10. You have 10, because once you have 10, you have the Shechina present, and therefore you can use these these titles of honor when you're speaking to people, telling them to stand or to sit as part of the procession, the funeral procession. Okay. We said that we do not say the mourner's blessing, or we do not say the Sheva brachas that are recited at the wedding, less than 10. So first thing the Gemara wants to know is, what is Birchas Avelim? What does this mean, the mourner's blessing? So the Gemara says like this, that it's the blessing that is made on the street, meaning when after returning from the burial, right, a person would say a series of blessings during the first meal that the mourners were served. That's the Sudas Havra'ah, right? It was a special meal that was served to them. So one of the blessings that was recited for the people who gathered to console the mourners was basically, this is the way he writes it over here, is, our brethren, the master of rewards will pay your reward. Blessed is Hashem who pays reward. And another blessing was recited for the mourners, which it was, our brethren, the master of consolation will console you. Blessed is Hashem who consoles the mourners. So these blessings that were made could not be made if there were less than 10 people there. Then the Gemara goes on to say, the mourner's blessing is recited only in the presence of 10 men, but the mourners are not counted as part of the quorum. You need to have 10 people besides the mourners. Now, when it comes to the Sheva brachas that you make at a wedding, you have to have 10 men, but unlike the mourners who are not counted as part of the 10, the chassan can be one of the 10. The groom could be one of the 10 people who are going to make up this minyan, make up 10. All right, the next thing from our Mishnah that the Mishnah had said is, the Mishnah says that we don't make the invitation to come and bench, Rabbi Sayin Nevarech, or Rabbi Sayin Megilla mention, right, including Hashem's name, right, which is Nevarech, Lelekeinu, Nevarech Lelekeinu, let us bless our God. We don't say that with less than 10. Why? Because since the one who invites everybody to bench says Nevarech Lelekeinu, it's not proper to do so with less than 10 people present. The same idea of saying Kaddish and Baruch Hu and with less than 10 people. So now, moving on to the last few things of the Mishnah, where it says that you need to have 9 people and a kohen as part of the quorum to estimate. Obviously, they want to bring at least one person who's got skin in the game, right? You want to have the kohen who it matters to him whether or not you get a better value or a lesser value. So they want to include him. The question is, how do we know, right, that you need to have 10 people? How do you know you need to have 10 people? So that's the first thing we're going to address. And then after we address how we know that you need to have 10 people, how do you know that only one of them has to be a kohen? Maybe all of them have to be Kohanim. So let's do this. So Shmuel says, right, that 10 Kohanim, the word Kohanim, appears 10 times in the section of the Torah that deal with consecrated things, right? So since the word Kohen is found 10 times, that's where we know that you're supposed to have 10 people. Now, the first one that's mentioned, the first time the Kohen is mentioned in the verse, that comes to teach you that you need to have a Kohen. Once you move on and you mention it again, this principle in the way we learn the Torah is that once you've mentioned something once, if you mention it again, it comes to be more expansive, right? Right? Excuse me. It comes to exclude. I apologize. It comes to exclude. If I say it once, it means I'm coming to teach you about the law itself. If I say it again, I'm coming to exclude anyone else. So when I say Kohen the first time, I'm telling you that you need to have a Kohen. When I say Kohen again, I'm telling you it has to be a Kohen and no one else. But since we don't only have 2 references, we have further references, right? When I mention Kohen a third time, then that comes to undo the exclusion. It comes to be more expansive. So it's like, a negative, then another negative. So that becomes a positive. So if I say you need to have a Kohen, then I say again, you need to have a Kohen. So then you say, okay, so you're telling me that you need to have only a Kohen, not anybody else, because you mentioned it twice. So you've come to exclude everybody else. But now when you mentioned it a third time, I'm scratching my head. What are you telling me? So the way the principle of hermeneutics works in this instance is that you say that the double negative, right, makes a positive, that it doesn't have to be a Kohen, it could be even a Yisrael. And this happens so all the times that you have the word Kohen appearing. From there we derive that only the first guy has to be a Kohen and all the others don't need to be a Kohen. To which the Gemara asks, and I'm jumping into this because I'm sure other people will have this question, so the Gemara will ask the question for you. Why do you assume that if I have Kohen appearing 10 times, right, that it's only the first one that teaches me it has to be a Kohen, and all the other 9 times teach me that it needs to be a non-Kohen? Maybe, perhaps, right, it should be 5 and 5, right? Why? The first one teaches me it's a Kohen. The second one teaches me that it can only be a Kohen. But the third one teaches me that it doesn't have to only be a Kohen. Okay, so now what we've got is 1 Kohen and 1 non-Kohen. But then the next one, that the next time the word Kohen appears, should be teaching me that it's only a Kohen, right? And if you keep on going in that fashion, you should end up with 5 and 5, not 1 and 9. Does that make sense? You understand what the Gemara is asking?
Yeah.
How did it get to 5? Why not 1 and 9?
Because if you're teaching me that each time you mention it, right?
Each time 1 and 1. Okay.
So then you're going to be going through the same cycle over and over.
Starting in the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th, and
that's
the 9th.
Right. That's correct. So yeah, so the 5th, the 7th, and the 9th, they're also going to be so it should be 5 and 5. So the answer, so the Gemara says, Kasha. Good question. Don't have an answer. Now, when the Gemara says that it's a Kasha, it's not a refutation. The question means that it's a difficulty, but the Gemara stays with its decision that this is still a good source to teach us that it's 1 Kohen and 9 non-Kohanim. However, it remains difficult, and there must be an answer that, but the Gemara doesn't offer it here. A teyufta, by contrast, a teyufta means it's a refutation. The question is so strong that there's no plausible answer, and therefore we have to refute what was suggested. Okay. The next thing the Mishnah said was that a person is the same as consecrated grounds, consecrated land. So the Gemara asked, can a person be legally sanctified? Then he needs to be appraised. So what does it mean? So the Gemara says, not the person himself cannot become sanctified. That's true. A person himself doesn't become sanctified. But what happens is he says, may my monetary value be upon me. That basically means that I want to donate the market value of my value. Like it says, it brings from a brisa that anybody who says, may my monetary value be upon me, we evaluate him as if he were a slave, and a non-Jewish slave is legally likened in scripture to land, right? Like it says, you shall hold them as a heritage for your children after you to inherit as a possession. So we see that slaves are compared to land. So therefore, we apply the same ruling that when a person has vowed to give his monetary value, we treat him like a slave, as if he had sold himself as a slave, right? For which you need to have an appraisal, just like you have to have an appraisal for the land. So that's what we do. That's what we do with somebody who dedicates himself or his value to the Beis Hamikdash. Okay. Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis, the bottom of the Amud. We're starting the Mishnah. Any questions before we move to the Mishnah?
I didn't quite get how they got to appraisal.
So we were discussing in the Mishnah, we were discussing what you need to have a minyan for. When do you need to have a quorum of 10 in order to be able to do something that is connected with Kedusha? So we mentioned a number of things, whether it's reciting Kedusha, whether it's reading from the Torah, and other things of that nature, right? However, at the end of the Mishnah, it included two more things for which you need to have a minyan. And what are those two things? One is when you want to estimate how much a piece of land is valued so that the owner of that land can give the monetary value to the Beis Hamikdash, thereby taking back his land for himself and using it. You need to have 10 people present to do that. You cannot just do that with one or two people. You need to have 10 people, and one of the 10 has to be a kohen. So that's how we got to it, okay?
So just because it's written karkaot, that means that it's appraisal of karkaot.
Yes, well,
because there is no word there about appraisal.
Right.
That's no.
So 1 second.
If someone gives a piece of land to the Beit HaMikdash, what does that mean?
Yeah. No. So Rashi, see, you're right. In the Mishnah, it doesn't explain explicitly what it means when just by the word karkaot, it doesn't tell you what it means. For that, you need to go to Rashi, where Rashi explains to us what it means. Rashi says, "V'har karkaot shel hekdesh," lands that have been sanctified for the Beis Hamikdash. Habolif teisan, if somebody wants to come to redeem it, right, to be able to then kind of buy it back, so to speak, so that it's no longer, because one is not allowed to have any benefit from something that has been consecrated to the Beis Hamikdash, because now once something is hekdesh, taking any benefit from it is a violation of a prohibition in the Torah. So what would you have to do? You'd have to come and you'd have to redeem it. How would you redeem it? You'd have to pay the value. But how do you know the value? You need to have it estimated. Well, in order to get it estimated, you need to have 10 people there to estimate it. So Rashi explains for us what karkaot is referring to. Yes, it's only in one word in the Mishnah, but Rashi explains it. Okay, moving on to the next Mishnah. When it comes to reading from the Torah, one who reads from the Torah in the synagogue should not read, and is not allowed to read, less than 3 verses. And he may not read more than 1 verse at a time for the translator, which means to say, in a synagogue that has somebody who's going to translate, you should not read more than 1 verse at a time. So you read 1 verse, then he translates 1 verse. You read the next verse, then he translates the next verse, because we don't want the translator to have to work really hard to try and remember everything that he heard and give an accurate translation. Because when it comes to the reading of the Torah, the people who are gathered there to listen, the instructions in the verse are really important because this is the Torah. And if we're going to ask the translator to translate more than one verse at a time, people may not get an accurate translation and walk away misunderstanding. That's why you can only read one verse at a time and have it translated one verse at a time. However, here we move over to 24a. However, when it comes to reading from the prophets, here we say you can read 3 verses at a time. What's the difference between the reading of the Torah and the reading of the prophets? The reading of the prophets is not coming to introduce any new laws that don't already exist in the 5 books of Moses. So therefore, we're not as concerned. Whereas the Torah itself, those are real laws. I mean, one verse can have important laws that are relevant to a person's life, and the translator should only have to translate one verse at a time. Now the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, that when it comes to reading from the prophets, if the 3 verses from the prophets are 3 separate paragraphs, which means you can have in one chapter 3 verses, one following the other, each one being a different paragraph, meaning it's its own topic, its own paragraph. In that case, then you have to read it one by one, different to how you have to read all the other verses in the prophets. Now, with regards to reading different sections in Navi, you can skip from one place to another place in the book of the reading and the reading of the books of the prophets, but one should not skip from one section in the Torah to read another section in the Torah. And how much can you skip when reading the prophets? Only until a point when the translator would have to pause. In other words, if you can roll your scroll of the prophets from one place to another in the amount of time that it would take for the translator to translate the last 3 verses that you read, then it's okay. Beyond that, you should not skip any further, because then it's not respectful to the community to keep people waiting. Okay. Now, moving on to the Gemara. Any questions on the Mishnah? Okay, so moving on to the Gemara. Says the Gemara, these 3 verses, who do they correspond to? So Rav Asi says the 3 verses that you're required to read, you cannot read less than 3. This corresponds to the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ksuvim, right? The 5 books of Moses, the books of the prophets, and the books of the writers. Our Mishnah says that a person cannot read for the translator more than 1 verse at a time, but with regards to the prophets, he could read 3, right? You could 3, and if the 3 were 3 different paragraphs, then you should read it 1 at a time. So the Gemara now gives us an example where you have 3 verses in the book of the prophets, and 1 verse after the other are 3 separate paragraphs. And this is in the book of Isaiah chapter 52, where it says, "For thus said Hashem, you were sold for nothing," which is followed by the verse which says, "My people went down initially to Egypt," and then it continues to say, the next verse, "Now what have I here?" says Hashem. And the Gemara points out that these 3 verses are separate topics, right? They're not a flow. They're not a continuation one from the other. So therefore, you should only translate them 1 verse at a time. Okay. The next part of the Mishnah says as follows. We can skip from section to section in the book of the prophets, but you cannot do that in the Torah. Right? The Gemara, I'll point a contradiction, says it says something in the Mishnah. It says that the Kohen Gadol would read on Yom Kippur from the portion that begins from Acharei Mois, and then he would read Ach Be'osar, which is not in the same portion. So how do you reconcile the fact that you're telling me that you're not allowed to jump from one place to another place in the Torah, only in the book of the prophets. Whereas here we see on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would read from Parashat Acharei Mos and then read Akba also, which is in a different Parsha altogether. So the Gemara answers, it's in Parshas Emor. The Gemara answers, it's not a question. Abaye says it's not a question. Why? Because here our Mishnah prohibits skipping when the translator will have time to pause before the reader reaches the new place. But where it says that you cannot read it in the Torah, it's because there's not going to be enough time to roll it while the translator is translating. Remember, when it comes to the prophets, we read 3 verses, then the translator translates three verses, right? In the Torah, it's only 1 verse that he translates. So when we say that the Kohen Gadol reads from Acharei Mos, and then he goes to Emor, so Acharei Mos and Emor, from the end of the reading of Acharei Mos till the portion in Emor where you're going to read for Yom Kippur is not such a far place, and you'd be able to roll it quickly before the translator is able to finish translating the verse that you've paused for him to translate, which would be the last verse. Okay.
Rabbi, question.
Yes.
When the Meturgeman, I guess, is doing the translation for the Nevi'im, is he allowed to give an explanation, or must it be an actual translation?
My understanding is that the Targum was never a literal translation, not for the Torah and not for the prophets. It was never a literal translation. It was always with commentary. It always tried to elucidate and explain what the verse actually meant. Okay, so
no, because I know that I'm learning the Tracer now, and Amos, and each line is an entire paragraph of trying to explain.
That's right.
What the explanations are.
That is correct. That is correct. So that would be true over here as well. That and that's why it makes more sense to talk about rolling the scroll when you're reading from the prophets, because when you're reading from the prophets and you have 3 verses, that's a considerable amount of time for the Meturgeman to explain what those 3 verses are talking about, which explains, by the way, what we said in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, that Rabbi Yechanan said after 10 verses you could stop. Why? Because the Meturgeman is translating these verses. So, you say 3 verses, then you translate it, explain it, elucidate it. By the time you finish, it's 15, 20 minutes just for 10 verses. So that's why, yeah, so you're correct, that it would be more than just a literal translation. So now the Gemara says, I don't like this distinction that you're making, because we've learned concerning this in a Mishnah where it says that we may skip from section to section in the reading of the prophets, but you cannot skip from section to section in the Chumash. And how much can one skip when reading from the prophets? It says until the point where the translator would have to pause. So since the Mishnah has already told me that you're only allowed to roll the amount of time you have for the Meturgeman to translate, that's the amount of time that you have. The fact that the Mishnah over there explicitly gave that time slot and nevertheless says that you cannot jump from place to place with the Torah, I would have to imply that the Mishnah is telling me you can never skip in the Torah, and the limitation of reading only the amount of time that you're given by the time that the interpreter is going to be interpreting, that doesn't apply to the reading of the Torah. So therefore, since this doesn't really work, so Abaye tries to take a different approach, and he says maybe it's because the Mishnah, which permits skipping, is when both readings talk about the same subject, whereas here in our Mishnah where it says you're not allowed to skip around, it's when it's talking about two separate subjects. And this is actually something that's taught in a brisa, that the brisa says we may skip in the reading of the Chumash from section to section within one topic, which is something that, by the way, we actually do. I think it's the only time we do this. The only time in the year where we skip from one place to another when you're reading in the Torah, from the same Sefer Torah, is on a fast day. You start with Vayichal Moshe, you read that paragraph, and then you roll over about 2 columns, and then you continue reading right? But what's the reason why it's permissible? Because, as it says in the Brisa, it's within one topic. You're talking about the same topic, the forgiveness of the Jewish people for the sin of the golden calf. But with regards to the Brisa continues with regards to skipping with the prophets, there you can even skip around if it's 2 different topics. Both here, when it comes to reading the Chumash, and there when it comes to reading to the prophets, we may skip only until the point where the translator would have to pause. In other words, if he's going to finish his translation and you're still rolling, that would not be okay. But so long as he's still translating, you can roll, and so you have to kind of work that out in advance to make sure that you can go to a place that you'd be finished rolling before the translator finishes. The Gemara now cites a brisa which qualifies one of the rulings that were mentioned above. And it says, it was taught in another brisa, that we may not skip from one book of the prophets to another book of the prophets, and but in the book of the 12 prophets, you can skip from one book of the prophets to another book of the prophets. In other words, if you're going to skip from one place in Yeshayahu to another place in Yeshayahu, that's okay. But you can't skip from Yeshayahu to Yirmiyahu, right? However, when it comes to the 12 prophets, right, the minor prophets, the reason why they're called minor is not because they were small, but because the books were only a few paragraphs, a few chapters, and so therefore they would put them all together in one scroll, right? So when it comes to the Shnei Asa, which are in one scroll, you could go from one book to another, so long as you're going in order. You cannot go backwards. You cannot go from Zechariah to Micha, for example, right? You can only go forward. You can only skip from the Shnei Asa from one book to the other, so long as you're moving from an earlier book to a later book in the scroll itself. And that is the end of this piece of Gemara, and I think we'll stop here. I wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
No problem.
Rabbi, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.